Ufuk Akçit is a brilliant professor at the University of Chicago, where he specializes in macroeconomics, innovation, and economic growth. He doesn't need an introduction, but I'll do my job anyway. Ufuk Hoca completed his undergraduate studies at Koç University before obtaining his PhD in economics from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His research focuses on understanding the drivers of economic growth, particularly through the lens of innovation and productivity. He has made significant contributions to the literature of how policies and economic conditions influence the innovative activities of firms and their impact on economic performance. His work often combines rigorous theoretical modeling with extensive empirical analysis. And in addition to his academic appointments, Professor Akçit has received numerous awards and honors for his research, including the Kiel Institute Excellence Award in Global Economic Affairs and National Science Foundation Career Award. He is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a co-editor for the Journal of Political Economy. What makes him even more exceptional is his influence extends beyond academia, and he frequently collaborates with policymakers and international organizations to translate his research findings into practical economic policies aimed at fostering innovation and sustainable growth. I could go on and on, but I will let you enjoy him, and I don't want to steal from his time. Ufuk Hocam, words are not enough to introduce you, but the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this extremely kind and generous introduction. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. I've been following your conference for quite a while, and you're doing really a remarkable job. So I would like to really congratulate you. And I wanted to be there physically, but due to a number of reasons, I couldn't be there. It's definitely my loss, but hopefully we'll make up for it next time. Today, I would like to talk about industrial policy, and let me share my screen with you and talk through the slides. And hopefully, we can, if you have any questions, hopefully we can have a floor discussion at the end. But again, also, if you have any further questions or comments, definitely please feel free to get in touch anytime. So today I'm going to talk about hidden risks of industrial policy. And basically, these days there's a lot of interest on industrial policy. There are big supporters of industrial policy. There are a lot of people are also potentially concerned about the industrial policy. So rather than having a philosophical conversation about this important topic, I would like to look at the data and see what we can learn about the impact of industrial policy on the economy. So this is the first graph that I would like to start with. And this graph is basically showing the R&D to GDP ratio in the United States. By the way, in my talk, first I'm going to talk about the US economy, because we have a lot of very interesting data and facts. And then towards the end of my talk, I will switch to the Turkish economy and conclude with some observations from the Turkish economy. So this graph shows the R&D to GDP ratio starting from 1980. In 1980, the total R&D to GDP ratio was about 2%. And today, that number went up to 3.5%, a massive rise, almost doubled relative to GDP. But if you think about any growth model, take your favorite growth model, the main prediction of those models are that if you spend more in R&D, we should grow faster. So now, what do we see in terms of the economic growth? When we look at the productivity growth in the data, this dashed line is showing the historical average. When I say historical, it's between 1960 and 1985. This is the productivity growth. And during the time when the R&D to GDP ratio was going up, the productivity growth did not go above the historical levels, except with the exception of the early 2000s. If anything, we observe a productivity slowdown. So clearly, something doesn't add up. the theory says that we have, once we invest more in R&D, we should grow faster, but we don't have evidence for that. So what's happening? I think that's an important puzzle that we should dive deeper. Now, the big picture that I would like to ask today is, why do higher investments in innovation in the US result in lower returns over time? So this is the big picture question that I would like to answer. And I think to answer that question, we should, rather than staying at the macro level, we should go more and more to micro level, so that we can understand what's happening at the firm level and also at the individual level. Once we derive some lessons, then we can aggregate things up to the macro level and hopefully come up with some authoritative policy messages. So this is the first graph that I would like to start with. This is the average markup over time, again starting from 1980 onwards. I think 1980 was an important break in the data in many dimensions. So this is the average markup. Obviously, it's price over marginal cost. When we look at the average markup has been increasing since 1980. And a lot of course, a lot of studies successfully show that markups can be a very good metric for market power. But let's look at other facts too. Of course, markups themselves doesn't necessarily imply profit because of fixed cost and other things. So that's why this graph is directly looking at the profit to GDP ratio, and profit to GDP ratio is also increasing during that time. Markups go up, profit to GDP ratio is increasing substantially during the same period. Of course, when the profit component of GDP is increasing, it should be coming from somewhere. And when we look at the labor share of GDP, labor share has been decreasing. So there's a massive reallocation from workers towards business owners during that time. So labor share is decreasing. Now, what about business dynamism indicators? So what are the business dynamism indicators? We like to have dynamic economies, because dynamic economies means more ideas, more innovation, newer technologies, better quality products. So we like to have dynamic economies, and dynamism can be measured by new entrants, or dynamism can be measured also by incumbents. So I'm going to look at both measures for dynamism. So when we look at the entry rate, number of new businesses divided by the number of incumbent businesses, the entry rate has been decreasing during the same time. So number of new business formation divided by the number of incumbent used to be about 14%. Now it's down below 8%. So almost a 50% reduction in entry rate. Every economy, be it the US economy or the Turkish economy or the German economy, every economy needs fresh blood, because new companies are typically, new entrepreneurs are typically coming with better ideas, unless it's out of necessity. Typically, new entrants are bringing new ideas, and we see that dynamism coming through new entry is decreasing during that time. Now, as I said, dynamism has two components. One of them is from the entrant side, but let's look at the incumbents. So when we look at the incumbents, they can also be dynamic. And innovation don't necessarily come only through entrants, but the innovation can also occur through incumbents. But in a healthy economy, what should happen is that those firms that are experiencing a positive productivity shock should be growing, and the ones that are experiencing a negative productivity shock should be shrinking. And as a result, the resources should be reallocated from less productive to more productive firms. And that's why job reallocation rate in the literature has been an important indicator for a dynamism for incumbents. And job reallocation rate is one important metric for resource reallocation. It's calculated as job creation plus job destruction rate. When we look at the job reallocation rate, that's also decreasing. So from many different angles, as I've shown you, there's a declining dynamism overall. So what have we seen so far? Indeed, there are many other indicators. With Sina Atesh, we recently published a paper that's looking at the business dynamism in the US from many different angles. I haven't shown you all these graphs, not to bore you, but in that paper, we are summarizing 10 facts. First, market concentration is increasing, markups are increasing, profit to GDP ratio is increasing, labor share is decreasing. Interestingly, market concentration and labor share are negatively correlated. So in those markets where concentration is going up, labor share is decreasing. Entry is decreasing. You know, there are many, many different indicators showing that the business dynamism is declining. So let's stop for a second. R&D to GDP ratio is increasing. There is more and more investment into R&D. Productivity is slowing down. Dynamism is slowing down. So what's really important here is we need to understand that the composition of the economy is changing. So rather than just looking at the level of investment, we have to also look at the composition of investment, and that's exactly what I will try to do next. So what happened since 1980? Well, 1981 was the first year when US government has introduced R&D tax credit at the federal level. And in 1982, Minnesota was the first state to introduce R&D tax credit at the state level. So starting from 1981, both at the federal level and at the state level, there has been more and more support for R&D. So R&D tax credit is effectively giving firms an indirect subsidy for them to invest more in R&D. So what do we see in return? This is the R&D intensity defined as the R&D over sales for publicly traded companies. So these are traded in the stock market. And when you look at the R&D intensity by publicly traded companies, indeed, it used to be a little bit flat before 1981, but starting with 1981, there's a massive rise. So an important observation so far is that the aggregate R&D is going up, productivity is slowing down, dynamism is slowing down, and publicly traded companies at the micro level seem to also start to increase their R&D investment relative to their size quite aggressively. So are these policy interventions somewhat triggering, especially larger firms, to invest more in R&D? The answer is a big yes. So this is a brand new result that we calculated recently. So what we have done with Nathan Goldschlag from US Census Bureau, we put together a new data set, and by merging patent data to firm level data, now we are able to say quite a bit of things, not only about their R&D investment, but also about their hiring patterns of inventors. And I'm going to show you quite a few new results based on this new study. But first of all, this graph is showing at the micro level the fraction of firms that are claiming R&D tax credit. And on the x-axis, we have firm size groups. And on the y-axis, within each firm size group, what fraction of those companies are claiming R&D tax credit. And what we see here is that large firms are claiming R&D tax credit disproportionately more. This means that, of course, even though these type of policies are well-intended policies, obviously, and these policies are implemented to boost innovative activity in the US or in any economy where these type of policies are implemented, what we see here is that there is a disproportionate effect on the economy. It's not subsidizing everybody at the same way. It's helping large firms disproportionately more. And as a result, probably we shouldn't be surprised by this massive rise. So this means that innovative activities are being tilted more and more towards large firms. So now we added a new observation to the list. Innovative activity is shifting more towards large firms over time. Okay. So far, I'm not claiming, I have to be clear that so far I'm not claiming that this is necessarily bad. what I've shown you so far is at the macro level, there's a slowdown, and at the micro level, innovative activity is shifting more and more towards large firms. But I haven't shown you the relationship yet. Okay, as I mentioned, we put together a brand new data set where we merged census data with the US patent data. That way, we are able to see the patent producers, the inventors, and the company that's hiring them or employing them. And we can also see the salaries of these people. Okay, so the salary component will be particularly important. So what are we seeing here? Unfortunately, the data starts from 2000. It's not available for earlier years, but this is already informative. Post 2000, we see a massive reallocation of inventors from small firms towards large firms. So this graph, on the x-axis we have the years, on the y-axis we see the fraction of inventors working for large incumbents. What is a large incumbent? It's defined as those firms that have more than 1,000 employees and they have to be older than 20 years. These are old large incumbents. They used to employ 48% of inventors. Now that number went up to 58% over time. So just in 15 years, there's a 10 percentage point increase in the fraction of inventors working for large incumbents. A massive shift towards large incumbents. Is this important? The answer is potentially yes, because in an earlier study with Bill Kerr from Harvard, we had looked at the relationship between firm size and innovation activity in terms of the innovation count and innovation quality. So the left graph is showing the relationship between firm size and the number of patents that they are producing per employee, and large firms are producing less patent on average relative to their size. You might say, well, maybe they are innovating more radical technologies, maybe they are innovating fewer patents, but the quality of the patent might be higher. That's why the right graph is looking at the quality of those inventions. Again, on the x-axis, we have the firm size. On the y-axis, we have the quality of innovation. What does this graph tell us? This is a regression where we regress quality of the patent on firm size dummies, and the excluded group is the smallest group. So that's why you see the coefficients here. Each bar is showing you the relative quality of the patent relative to the smallest firm patents. And as you can see, it becomes more and more and more negative, meaning that relative to the smallest firms, the quality of patents are decreasing very drastically as firm size increases. So now we start to see the big picture better and better. Innovative activities are shifting more and more towards large firms, and large firms on average are less innovative, both in terms of the patent counts and also in terms of the patent quality over time. Okay, so the large firm investment is one thing, but what about the startups? This is also a new result. Here, we are looking at the startups that are founded by an inventor versus a startup that's founded by a non-inventor. So the solid black line is showing the life cycle of a firm that's founded by a patent producer. This person has produced a patent. The person is an inventor. Whereas the gray line is showing you the life cycle of a firm that's founded by a non-inventor. So the person didn't produce any patent. What we see here is that inventor-founded firms are producing many more employment. Indeed, they produce 30 percentage points more employment in 5 years, just in 5 years. And it stays constant. So inventor-founded firms have much steeper life cycle profile. They are much more dynamic. And this is probably understandable because when an inventor produces a new technology, probably they are the ones who are seeing the future of this technology. And just like us, right? Whenever we sit down to write a new paper, we have an idea, but we see best where this project can go. It's very hard to give an idea to someone else and expect the person to deliver the same quality outcome, because typically the inventor himself or herself has the vision about the future. So that's why this is probably not surprising that the inventor-founded firms have much steeper life cycle profile. So that's an important observation. What happens to inventor entrepreneurship rate over time? This graph is showing that the entrepreneurship rate among inventors dropped by 44%. 44% drop in just 15 years. In the US, since year 2000, there is not only a shift of innovative activities towards large incumbents, but there's also a significant decline in entrepreneurship rate by inventors. So that's another important observation. So what's happening? What is the mechanism through which inventors are getting more and more reallocated towards large incumbents? Well, the data shows that the compensation that's being offered by large incumbents have been increasing much faster compared to the young and small firms in the economy. Indeed, that's what we call the incumbent premium. The incumbent premium is the wage that's being paid by large incumbents relative to small firms, and that has increased by 20% during that time. So incumbents are paying more and more to inventors. Okay, so is this necessarily a bad thing? That's exactly what I will try to answer in this graph. In this graph, I'm looking at an inventor who changes a job. So I work for a company, and then I switch to a new firm, and this firm is a large incumbent. So I move to a large incumbent. So if I move to a large incumbent, what happens? I'm going to look at two things. First, I'm going to look at the earnings, which is the wage, the salaries. When I look at the salary, which is this solid black lines, the salary compensation is increasing by 12%. When the same inventor, this is within inventor analysis, the same person changes a job and moves to a large incumbent, the salary increases by 12%. You might say, well, the person becomes more innovative probably in large firm, that's why he or she is being compensated. The answer is no. The person becomes less innovative after moving to a large incumbent. Indeed, the innovativeness of the person relative to before the move, the innovativeness of the person starts to decrease after the move. So when the inventor moves to a large incumbent, the salary goes up by 12%, but the innovativeness of the same person declines by 6%. So as a result, now we have a much clearer picture that reallocating inventors towards larger firms doesn't necessarily bring more innovation. Now, having seen all these results, I think now we can see two competing hypotheses in our minds. So first, of course, we have a knowledge frontier, which is indicating the best possible practices that the humankind can do, and this is the technology frontier. And every time entrants are introducing a new technology, we are pushing the technology frontier forward. Now, incumbents can also react to this by introducing even better technologies. And if that's the case, in that case, innovation by entrants can be pro-competitive, and it can encourage incumbents to invest more in R&D, more in innovation, and as a result, the whole market can become more competitive and we can deliver more technologies in return. But there's an alternative story. So this is the pro-competitive model. Okay, this is the pro-competitive model. Incumbents have an alternative strategy here. Incumbents can either react to new entry by competing with them, or incumbents can potentially resist the change. So if incumbents can make sure that they can block entrants in that case, they can also slow down technological progress and still make money, because that way, think about the telecom company, for instance. I'm an incumbent and I'm selling a phone service or internet service every month, and my customers are paying me $50 every month, and I'm making money. As long as nobody comes and kicks me out, I'm just making money. So as a result, sometimes incumbents can also have an incentive to resist the change, and as long as they can block entry, they can still make money. And this is the anti-competitive model that I have in mind. Okay, it can be pro-competitive model, or it can be an anti-competitive model, and this is called the Arrow's replacement effect. Arrow's replacement effect says that when firms are young, they have every incentive to do something radical to prove themselves to the market. But as they gain more and more market share, they develop an incentive to resist the change and to block entry. And the evidence that we have seen so far is supporting the anti-competitive model. So I'm going to continue a little bit more to see what the data really tells us. I looked at the average trends so far, but let's look at the superstar startups, because of course, many firms are producing patents, but superstar startups are particularly more transformative. So superstar startups have some breakthrough technologies, and they are growing very fast. The way we define superstar startups is we look at the best 10% of the startups in terms of growth, job growth. So if they are growing their employment very fast, and if they are within the top 10% in terms of the growth, then we call it superstar startups. So if an inventor of a superstar startups being poached by a large incumbent, then the inventor this time experiences 28% increase in salary, and the innovativeness of the inventor drops by 46%. Much stronger result. Previously, the average pattern was 12% increase and 6% decline. Now, when we focus on superstar startups, now the inventors experience 28% increase in salary when they leave the superstar startup and move to a large incumbent, and their innovativeness declined by 46%. So then what happens to the superstar startup when they lose their inventor? They experience 10% slower growth after the departure of the inventor. So as you can see, the reallocation of inventors from where they are very productive towards large incumbents is overall generating a drop in the economy. So they are becoming less innovative in large incumbents, and the startup itself is also growing slower after the move. Now, how does the policy influence these dynamics? Because the initial motivation that I started was that there is more and more government support for R&D. So does the government support in terms of R&D subsidies contribute to these changes, contribute to these switches? The answer is an absolute yes. So in the data, we can see at the state and industry level whether they have an active R&D subsidy policy or not. So R&D subsidy policies are determined at the state and industry level. So that's why you can come up with this 0-1 observations at the industry and state level. And now I'm going to ask a very simple question. Does the market share of the large firms correlate with whether that industry state have an active R&D subsidy policy? The answer is yes. Those industries and states that have an active R&D subsidy policy have much higher market concentration in terms of the market share of the large firms, which suggests that the industrial policy in terms of the R&D subsidies might also be contributing significantly to the rise in concentration, because we see this strong correlation between the market concentration and active industrial policy. Now, can we say something more concrete at the firm level? This result was doing this analysis at the state and industry level. Now I'm going to ask at the very micro level, the role of policy. Now I'm going to ask the following simple question. Remember the event study where an inventor was changing a job and moving to a large incumbent? In that case, the inventor was earning more and becoming less innovative. So if an inventor changes a job and earns more but innovates less, I'm going to call it a red flag hire. Okay? A red flag hire is, so you see what AI, those firms that are claiming R&D tax credit are also being involved in red flag hires. Okay, so just to summarize the findings up until now is that at the very micro level, we see that the industrial policy in terms of the R&D tax credit is very strongly associated with the type of hires where earnings are going up, but the innovativeness of the person is going down. So that's why I think in light of this, we have to be less naive about the role of industrial policy in the sense that large firms and small firms don't have the same incentive to innovate. Indeed, large firms, as we saw, have an incentive to be anti-competition, and as a result, they have an incentive basically to slow down innovation and entry. So I would like to show you another supporting evidence from a completely different country. And this time I'm going to show you two graphs from the Italian economy. And in the case of Italy, we asked a very simple question. We said, as firms are growing in size, okay, innovation might be slowing down, but are they relying on some other anti-competitive strategies? And in this case, we are going to look at political connections of the firms. So we are going to ask the following question. How do political connections of firms affect innovation and creative destruction in general? And here it was a very interesting data merge exercise. We merged social security records with the register of local politicians. These are mayors, vice mayors, council members, more than 500,000 Italian local politicians. We merged with the social security records. And that way we can see which politician is working for which company. Because being a local politician is a part-time job. They can work for a company at the same time. And that way we can see if an active politician is working for a company at the same time. And this is my favorite graph because it really summarizes everything that happens in the economy. So now I'm going to look at a single market, and here market defined as a 6-digit industry times region times year. In a given year, in a given region, in a given industry, we look at the largest 20 firms, and for this largest 20 firms, we ask a very simple question. As the firm is becoming the dominant market leader, what happens to their pattern of hiring a politician or politician intensity? The number of politicians that they hire divided by the number of workers in the firm. So if there is no relationship between market leadership and the politician intensity, in that case, the relationship should be a flat line. Now the question is, do you think this will be increasing or decreasing as the firm is becoming the dominant market leader? The answer is that firms are hiring more and more and more politicians as they become the dominant market leader. Now, you might say this is not necessarily bad news because market leaders are the most innovative ones, and that's why new innovations, new technologies require new regulations. And to explain the need for new regulations to policymakers, they are hiring more politicians. So then let's look at the innovativeness of these firms. Now I'm going to ask a very simple question. What happens to their innovativeness as they become the market leader? And this is their innovation pattern. So as firms are becoming the dominant market leader, innovation is decreasing, politician intensity is increasing. So this is what we call the leadership paradox. Firms are relying more and more and more strategic behavior to slow down competition in general. So this is another graph that I would like to show you related to political connections. Now, I showed you that the firms are relying more on politicians, but we can ask the flip side of this. What happens to the politician in that case? What happens to a worker when this worker becomes a politician? So time zero is the time when there's an election. At time zero, there's a local municipality, there's an election for, electing the next mayor or, the council basically in the municipality. And I'm looking at the wage compensation of an ordinary worker. So this person before time zero is not a politician. It's just an ordinary worker. The person is an ordinary worker, and this is the normalized compensation of the worker. And as you can see, this is just a flat profile, and it's a stable compensation for 10 years before the election. At time zero, the same person becomes a politician and obtains a seat inside the municipality. Now the question is, what happens to the compensation of the same person by the same company? So the same firm's salary compensation that's being given to the worker after the worker is elected as a politician. This is the compensation. So once the worker becomes a politician, the politician's compensation starts to go up very, very drastically. So I think, and a very important message here is that firms of different size have completely different incentives in the market. As you know, I've shown you some evidence from the US, I've shown you some evidence from the Italian economy. Each time we see a similar pattern. Dominant market leaders are not trying to innovate more, but they try to rely more on some strategic behavior. In the case of US, it was strategic hires of inventors. In the case of Italy, it was the hiring of politicians. And when you do a back of the envelope calculation, if there's a pie or surplus that's being generated, you see that 20% of the surplus goes to the politician and 80% goes to the firm. Now, there was an Economist article talking about the role of lobbying and political connections, and it was giving really jaw-dropping numbers. And the article was claiming that the return on lobbying is close to 22,000%. I don't know how they calculated it, but they came up with some enormous numbers. So in the remaining few minutes, I would like to give you a little bit of some results from the Turkish economy, because I think once we have this intuition, now we can look at the Turkish data with a different, hopefully with a different lens. So the first thing I would like to show you is that, of course, GDP per capita for the Turkish economy and other economies, it's not a surprise that the Turkish economy, in terms of the GDP per capita, is a middle income country which was growing, but unfortunately since 2013 GDP growth has also changed its direction. But GDP growth itself is not informative, or GDP per capita growth is not informative, because we want to create high quality growth. Growth can happen in various ways. Indeed, Selva Hocam, she can also give a lot of, other evidence, but one can generate growth by simply boosting consumption, by simply, giving firms some subsidy to hire more workers, but these will be some short-term solutions. The actual long-term growth or high quality growth is coming from productivity growth. And when we look at the productivity growth in Turkish economy, unfortunately, for a very, very long period of time, we do not observe growth in productivity. And this is being missed in the conversations. We are too much focused on GDP per capita growth, and for certain periods, we think that the economy has been successful in terms of GDP per capita growth, but even in that episode, the productivity growth wasn't there, basically. When we look at the long-term productivity trend, if anything, there has been ups and downs, but we don't see a growth. Now, in light of all these earlier conversations, the first thing we should ask ourselves is also, how are the resources allocated in the economy? And unfortunately, in the Turkish economy, a similar picture emerges. So when we look at, for instance, in terms of the R&D to GDP ratio, when we look at the R&D to GDP ratio, in Turkey, R&D to GDP ratio is very, very low. Indeed, we are very, very behind of the OECD countries. Or when we look at, for instance, the number of papers that are being written per capita, again, in terms of the scientific output, again, we are very much behind. But when we look at the government support in terms of the subsidy that's being offered to private sector, in terms of percentage, we are way above the OECD countries. Or when we look at the fraction of investment in tertiary education relative to GDP, again, we are way above the OECD countries. So a similar picture emerges here too. So in terms of the government involvement, it seems that the government is spending a lot of resources, but in terms of the outcomes, the outcome is very, very poor. R&D is not being invested in, and in terms of the scientific outcomes, the scientific output is not high. Now, of course, when we think about creative destruction and innovation, the basic premise is that entrants should bring better technologies and they should replace incumbents that are unproductive. So by definition, entrants should be more productive than the exiters. What we see in the Turkish economy, this is the productivity level. This is the productivity level of entrants compared to exiters. What we see in the data is that entrants are less productive than exiters. So this shows that in terms of the competition, something is not right. So something is not working well, because normally competition should, the actual competition should imply that entrants should be more productive than exiters. But we see the reverse. So it means that the firms in the Turkish economy are not competing only based on productivity. Okay? So clearly creative destruction is not happening. And then, of course, there are a lot of regulations. And one of the regulations in the Turkish economy says that firms above 50 workers are subject to additional regulations. So when we look at the impact of this particular regulation, where firms above 50 are subject to some additional regulations, like for instance, they have to have some health personnel on the side. They are subject to more audits. Small firms are not receiving audits, but once they are above 50, they are subject to more audits, and there are some additional taxes that they have to pay. What we see here is that firms start to bunch before 50 workers. And when we look closer in terms of the firm size distribution, the firm size distribution doesn't come this, just like the red line. Indeed, there's more and more bunching before 50. And when we take a closer look in terms of the firm growth, what we see is that firms right below 50 versus right above 50 seem to show completely different patterns. So the regulations that are being imposed seem to create some different incentives for firms that are above 50 versus that are below 50. And here's an interesting graph, and I think this is very telling for the Turkish economy. So when we look at the labor productivity, which is the output divided by the number of workers that are being reported in the official data, firms that are below 50 seem to look like as if they are more productive than firms that are above 50. Clearly, that cannot be right? So the firm dynamics literature is very loud and clear on this. Large firms are more productive on average. So this cannot be, it cannot be the case that the firms just at 49 or 48 are more productive than those firms that are at 42 or 43. So what's happening here? Clearly, firms are producing by relying on informal workers. So these type of regulations are triggering informality. As a result, firms are producing relying on informal workers. So as a result, the numerator is going up, but the denominator is not going up because they are not simply registering their workers. So as a result, these type of things are triggering significant informality. And so overall, I think, when we think about the government policy, we should be, I think rather than taking a naive approach, we have to be much more mindful that, different firms in the economy have different incentives. And normally market leaders have very different incentives than young businesses in the economy. And when we are designing our industrial policy, we have to take that into account. But when it comes to the Turkish economy, those are for advanced economies, basically. That consideration is for the advanced economy. But when we start thinking about the Turkish economy, additional considerations start to come in when we talk about industrial policy. First, it's very clear that firms are not competing only over the productivity, because as I've shown you, entrants are less productive than exiters, which means that firms are generating some different benefits through some other means. And I think we have to look at the data to identify what those additional benefits are. And second, informality is very visible. And as I've shown you, whenever there's a regulation, at least it shows clearly how firms are strategically hiring informal workers, and especially in light of what happened in recent years in terms of also, a lot of unregistered workers or immigration flow in Turkey. I think the Turkish economy is subject to more and more into this informal economy, which I think, whenever again we are thinking about the industrial policy, we have to also factor these type of things into account. And a country like the Turkish economy can generate growth only through productivity. And unfortunately, for a very, very long period of time, the Turkish economy is not generating high quality growth. And of course, many scholars, including people in the room and Selva Hoca and many other people have been bringing this up, this issue up over and over again. But I think it is really time for us to recognize that we should not just aim for any growth. We should not just aim for, let's bring more funding from outside, let's subsidize firms to hire more workers, etc. Those are very artificial. Even if they generate, those type of policies generate growth, they are very short term and very artificial. As soon as you pull the subsidies back, those hirings or those type of growth vanishes immediately. We need to generate high quality growth, and high quality growth can happen only through technology. And for a country like Turkey, I think high quality growth can happen through maybe, doing cutting edge research is still too early for a country like Turkey, but at least we need to think about ways where we can bring technologies around the world to the country. And this can happen through FDI, but FDI has to be where firms are also bringing their technology, or we have to also utilize the diaspora. I mean, there are a lot of fantastic people in the classroom, obviously, and there are many more around the world. And I think we as I think the policymakers have to think harder about how to utilize the diaspora so that there can be more knowledge flow and more technology flow into the country. And that's the only way we can really generate high quality growth. So let me not take more time. And, the day has been long for you. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Hocam, thank you very much. It was a great talk. And we had the growth numbers for Turkey last week. I think it also puts things in context. We have a couple of minutes, and I see one question in the Q&A box. I'll just read it very quickly, and maybe there are some additional questions in the room. So the question is from Furkan Mustafa Çetin. And he says, I think anti-competitive mechanism is very plausible for decrease in growth while R&D spending and intensity increase. But I'm also wondering about your view on the role of increasing intangibles in the economy. It can decrease the incentives to patenting compared to keeping trade secrets like AI training. This would increase duplicate R&D efforts and decrease R&D spending to growth. Increase in intangibles can also make easier to poach inventors to steal technology, like Apple versus Massimo.
Absolutely. No, that's a fantastic observation, and there is more and more evidence, and there are also more and more reports that are being written on this. Indeed, for instance, one poster child of this is pharmaceuticals. And so the pharma industry recently wrote a number of reports. So they prepared jointly some reports about what's happening in pharma industry. And they've shown that firms are spending more and more and more in duplicative R&D, whereas the drug approval rate is remaining constant. So, there's also more and more killer acquisition happening in pharma industry. So large incumbent firms are strategically hiring more, or trying to buy small firms and eat them up so that they wouldn't become competitors in the future. But related to that, I think data becomes also a critical input for production and for R&D. And large firms have, again, a disproportionate edge on this. Large firms have a lot more data, and digital transformation is also happening predominantly among large firms. Normally, the inequality among firms was increasing, but the introduction of AI and the whole IT revolution, I think, will just speed up the rise in inequality among firms. So that's why I think when we are thinking about industrial policy, I think we are we are in a risky spot where both the underlying technology and the current industrial policy, the way it's being designed, will just accelerate the rise in inequality. And I think, things will not get better. So that's why, given that there's the whole debate about how to, consider industrial policy, we have to take all these things into account. And having said that, I think for economists like us, there are very important research opportunities because we still don't know very well how AI is influencing firm dynamics. Broadly, we have some preliminary evidence on how IT investment or how robots are affecting employment, but still we are at a very early stage. So that's why I think this is a very fruitful area to do research. And I see also a lot of young people in the audience. So I think the impact of AI on overall economy and economic growth is still very much understudied, and hopefully in the years to come, we will have more authoritative conclusions.
Okay. Can I ask
I
a
believe,
question?
yeah, there's one
Okay.
question from the room, and let's take it as the last question.
Okay. So Ufuk Hocam, thank you very much for this very enlightening talk. I actually am wondering if the trends that you have shown for the US are similar for other, let's say, Western economies, or is there kind of unique elements in terms of the business dynamism in the US?
This is an extremely important question because people are a little bit confused, I would say, about this. Indeed, the studies show that there's quite a bit of heterogeneity across countries, even among advanced economies. Let's take one example, Germany. The business dynamics in Germany are very, very different than the US economy. And for instance, the US economy has been growing, predominantly through its entrance, startups introducing radical technologies. whereas the German economy historically has been relying on its incumbents. Think about, for instance, Mercedes, BMW, Audi, or Puma and Adidas, or Siemens and Bosch. In every industry in Germany, things are dominated by large incumbents. So that's why even among advanced economies, things are not very similar. So as a result, the German economy has been dominated by large incumbents, but German economy has kept them under tight competition over time. Whereas the US economy has relied more on entrants, but now market concentration is increasing due to deregulations and all these industrial policy in 80s and 90s. And that's why we see this strong slowdown in the US economy and labor share decreasing, etc. But we don't see similar patterns in the German economy, because German economy somehow had a tighter competition policy and they were used to these type of dynamics for very long time. Whereas for the US, these dynamics are more recent. And I think, I think the policymakers will have more frank conversation moving forward, because now there's an increased concern about the rising inequality and rising concentration and slowdown in productivity. So that's why this is a new territory, or an uncharted territory for the U.S. economy, whereas the other advanced economies like Germany has been used to these type of situation for a very long time, and they had tighter competition policy historically. So that's why things are different in different economies.
I think we did great with timing, and it's about time to wrap things up to manage the time more effectively. I would like to thank everyone and the organizers for this workshop, which is now becoming the Turkish tradition in London. And thanks everyone, and hope to see you again very soon.
Thanks so much, everyone. It was really a pleasure to be here today. Bye.